And start streaming, and off we go.
Mm-hmm.
All
Okay.
right. Thank you. Charles Moscowitz here. And I'm joined by Eric Stryker. Eric is referred to as an alt-right author, writer. You're a very prolific writer, Eric.
Thank
And
you.
you use, like I do, you use a pseudonym, and I get that because I do the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be careful in this day and age.
Yeah.
And
Samostat.
one of the things that interests me about your biography, and correct me if I'm wrong,
Mm-hmm.
is that it seems like when you started to dabble in politics when you were in college in New York, you were on the left, and then you shifted over to the right. And I've noticed that a lot of people, especially when you get to really good extreme politics, they tend to interface. There's a lot of that. There's left, right, and then sometimes back to the left, and then back to the right. So talk a little bit about your political development, if you will.
Yeah. Well, I started changing opinions actually before college. I was a Marxist briefly,
Mm-hmm.
just for like a year or two, really, when I was a teenager. And I find that a lot of times young people will feel like there's something off in society, and that's usually the first answer you get because in our pop culture, you got things like Rage Against the Machine and things like that. And also, I had some acquaintances that were they were left wing, in terms of I wouldn't say they were necessarily communists. They were older people actually, but they were communists in their day, and they had interesting books and stuff like that. Also, the big thing when I was a teenager was also stuff like Occupy Wall Street, the bank bailout. So, left-wing populism was very popular, but also I was very attracted to different ideas and so on. And also, I saw a lot of injustices in society and was very much concerned with my surroundings, and I couldn't quite put my finger on.
Let me just interject also and point out, and I think this is kind of obvious, that the left wing is more fun and culturally, that's where the women are, right?
I think we might have an age difference there, Charles, because when I was younger, if you went to it depends on what branch of the left. I actually, when I was a leftist, I missed out on that because I was in a weird phase. And also the groups I was interested in, like the Workers' World Party. There's no women in that. Everyone there when I was a kid was an older guy.
Kind of scowling looking people with ashen faces and, gray ponytails and, that kind of look.
Yeah. It's kind of like kind of Berkeley burnouts and stuff were really big. I don't know if you know anything about the Revolutionary Communist Party.
Not all that much, no.
Yeah. They
not exactly a barrel of laughs, though.
Excuse me? Oh, yeah. No, they're humorless.
Yeah,
absolutely humorless.
We're talking about very high, righteous people who think that the aggrieved party. They think that everything is everything is put on them, and this whole mentality.
Well, there's a very strong Puritan streak on the left, which is kind of interesting. Yeah. It's very much like I had a debate with an actual communist, like someone who believes in Marxism, Leninism. And this guy started the debate by quoting the Bible at me. And I found that very, very interesting, knowing the history of communism where, Bibles were in a fire pit. So, but,
right.
The modern left has a very strong kind of puritanical streak where, and you see this in their ideological debates too, where if you break with orthodoxy in any way, you get the Inquisition after you, the left-wing Inquisition, and that's kind of
a re-education camp where you have to undergo self-criticism. And
also, God, yes.
To point out, if on the left, they may be puritanical, but it's entirely situational. They may be puritanical for themselves, but not for others. For the rest of the world, they don't care.
Yeah, but they're quite a bit onto purity spirals on certain issues, and that's kind of what made me break away from the left. Aside from seeing also different issues opening up to me, I started to think more about my heritage, my European heritage, and started to think more about multiculturalism, and I was never necessarily bigoted, but I started to have experiences in my life that started to shake my views that I was taught in social studies, right? That you're taught since you're a kid, that you're taught from the television and so on, about, whether multiculturalism and whether, liberalism and things like that, whether those ideas are necessarily good. Not just like good for personal well-being, but good for society as well. And so when it comes to this kind of thing, if you start asking questions about that on the left, oh boy, you get lynched. Okay, and another thing too is the gay stuff too was big. And I didn't like some of the aspects of the sexual revolution. I thought they were a bit excessive, things like that. And seeing the left take up cultural liberalism was a huge push for me to leave the left.
No, I mean, I get that. I mean, that's sort of, is to a broad sense why I consider myself to be conservative. But you went into, tell me where that brought you. I mean, in terms of your beliefs today.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a very long story, but at this point, I consider myself to be a third positionist, and I'm very interested in the European populisms of the 1930s. I know you're Jewish, you might get offended, so let's. I'm not sure what your beliefs are. I actually don't know much about you, Charles.
No, right. I am Jewish, and and as I told you in an email, I do consider myself to be very pro-Zionist. I believe in the nation state of Israel. When you say the national, I mean, and I'm a nationalist, both for the United States and Israel and other nations, and this is one of the reasons that I support Donald Trump. I think that the nation state is a progressive thing. It's something that, and especially now that we're having this disease, I think it only proves that a nation has to have control over its own destiny, and over the lives of its own people. I mean, it's obvious to me. I mean, this is a normal thing. So, and it is opposed to this globalist, internationalist order movement that has predominated the top levels of our culture, and that has fooled a lot of other people. So, in that sense, I mean, I am. But when you say nationalist, are you talking Nazism, or what do you mean?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not going to say I'm a Nazi, but I do think there are many interesting things politically about the Third Reich and about Germany in the 1930s. I think there are many interesting things about phalangism. There are many interesting things about Mussolini. I think that some of the history about these countries has been sort of used by the Allies as a kind of dialectic after the Second World War. I mean, it might be different for you, and I hope you can detach yourself, as I'll try to detach myself to understand you. But the point I'm getting at here is that, if you believe that you're an anti-liberal, the thing is, what is the dialectic there? Well, the dialectic is that the United States must be a neoliberal country because of the Nazis in the Second World War, that anything that abandons liberal views on borders, anything that prioritizes sovereignty over globalism, anything that prioritizes the folk over capital, over internationalism, all of that stuff is seen as a sort of Nazism that will lead straight to Auschwitz. That is the actual opinion of the ruling class in America.
I agree with you on that. Any of the things that you mentioned, which again I would contend are normal things for any movement, they're immediately put into the category that they're anti-Semitic and that they're Nazi-like, and that's wrong. And I particularly point a finger of blame at a group like the ADL for that. It's just it's not, and they're not really, I would argue, operating in the interests of Judaism or the Jewish people. In fact, they're contradicting the fact that the Jewish people created a nation state and a very nationalist state as well in Israel. So, let's not be hypocritical about this. A nation state is something that we want and other people of the world want. Now, when you talk about Nazism and the Phalange and fascism, those movements up until really the late 1930s were viewed as left-leaning movements, and they were. They were. You look at the planks of the Nazi Party as it was established in the early 1920s. It reads almost like the Communist Manifesto. I mean, it was a distribution of power, of wealth. It was. Wow. I mean, I reject all of those things, except the fact that I do think Germany rightfully was asserting its sovereignty against the unfair treatment that it received after the end of World War I with the Treaty of Versailles. Mm-hmm. And I also would point out that Roosevelt was very pro-Mussolini when he took office, and America was asserting its sovereignty in those years as well. Where I draw the line, however, besides the leftist orientation of those movements, is their anti-Semitism, which is quite clear. And
I'm sorry. Let me just intervene for a second there, Charles. The Zionist movement, I mean, was a line so clear in the early days of the Zionist movement between the communists and the Zionists. The Israeli state had, if you know about the Israeli state, the land in Israel is owned by the government. You rent it from the government. So the idea that the reason why the Nazis were socialistic in their economic platform was because socialism and nationalism, and you might disagree, we could debate that. In my opinion, socialism and nationalism go hand in hand. That's why when we talk about socialized healthcare, we can also call it national healthcare. That's it's interchangeable, because the understanding is that to have a socialist system, you need to have borders. It's putting your people above all other values, whether it's profit, whether it's liberalism, whether it's all these other kind of cosmopolitan values. And the Zionists don't disagree. I mean, if you look at the Israeli system, until very recently, it was highly socialistic. The Israelis have one of the highest, in fact, they have the highest birth rate of all industrialized countries, of 3 for secular Jewish women. Part of that is a very, very generous welfare state that absolutely subsidizes child rearing. In fact, if you're a Jewish woman in her late 30s, you can go to a clinic a clinic to get in vitro for free. The government will pay for it. So, I mean, that's just common sense, in my opinion. The Israelis do it. And the Nazis did it too. So I don't know if I agree with you.
They did it for Aryans, but let me just
and Israel does it for Jews. Yeah.
That's right. No, I get that. Let me just unpack it a little bit here. I think that nationalism and socialism can be similar when nationalism becomes socialistic, but I don't think that nationalism itself is necessarily socialistic, and I don't think American nationalism is at all. American nationalism is based on the premise of limited government and local government and the sovereignty of the individual under God, as the Declaration of Independence expresses. And I think that's actually much closer to the genuine philosophical nature of Judaism and Christianity too. That and in America, that's what flowered this country. That's what made us who we are. And to my way of thinking, yeah, I mean, socialism has captured and even perverted nationalism as means of a worship of the state. The left worships the state. If you take a look, they want to have national health care, national welfare, national everything, national police, right? Remember, Obama talked about nationalizing the police. These things are the hallmark of Nazi Germany, and that's
Israel too. Israel has that as well.
I mean, to an extent, although Israel has moved away from it. Yes, Israel started out very socialistic.
Israel has national health care today.
Oh, they do, and
they have, most
industrialized nations do, and the
IDF. I'm not sure if their police force is run by the central government, but the IDF has quite a bit of power. I mean, the line between the military state in Israel and the private sector is not so clear. I mean, we look at things like the Israel. I wrote about this recently. The Israel Institute for Biological Research. That's basically a wing of the IDF researching biological weapons and so on. They also do research for medical stuff. But the point I'm getting at is, once again, when it comes to the concept of, say, private property, right? You have to rent it from the Jewish National Fund in Israel.
I agree with that. That's true. I mean,
they don't have real private property rights in Israel.
I think it's about 80-something% is owned by the.
Amazing. Yeah. It's
no, that's not. You're absolutely right. I mean, it was purchased by Edmund. It started to be purchased in the 19th century by Edmund Rothschild, and then when he died, he bequeathed it to the state of Israel, and he created this fund that would protect the land. And they continue to buy land. There's no question about that. That's
is that Nazism?
No, well, it's. I think it's unique to Israel. I don't know of any other nation. I mean, it's also
the Third Reich had that. The Third Reich was similar.
I would describe it as more communism, although the Jewish National Fund it's not seizing land; it buys land. And look, it's a very unique
distinction, sir. That is,
and it's a very unique system. Now, as far as the military, I don't think that Israel needs to apologize for that, because they're under siege by their neighbors. They're in a state of war.
Well, the Germans thought that too.
Yeah, but the Germans thought that, but I don't think that France and Denmark and Poland were threatening Germany's existence.
Well, the Treaty of Versailles, to defy the Treaty of Versailles, you need a big army, because anytime the Germans would step out of line on that, they would have French troops sniffing around and so on.
That turned out not to be the case after 1936, when the German army occupied the Rhineland and nothing happened. They could have stopped there.
Well, that's because they were becoming more militant. They were defying the various treaties that.
Their wars were not wars of defense after that. Their wars were wars of conquest. With the state of Israel, I would argue that they are defending the lives and the property and the livelihoods of their own people. And if the war was stopped, and I think it is stopping, I think that there is movements in that direction, and the genocidal attempt, interests of their neighbors was put aside, then Israel would become more normal. But Israel is in a state of war. There are peaceful periods, there are warlike periods, but it has
when it comes to wars of conquest, Charles, the Germans initially, remember, the Germans did not declare war on Britain and France. What happened was they marched into territories that were either full of Germans or previously German, places like Austria. Remember, the Austrians voted for the Anschluss. The Sudetenland was full of Germans. The part of Danzig, it had Poles in it, but this was previously and historically Ostpreußen. It was East Prussia that was cutting off German land with German citizens inside. Meanwhile, with Israel, the Gaza Strip, there's no Jews on the Gaza Strip. That was this is a product of Egypt.
And I don't think Israel has any interest in controlling the Gaza Strip. The problem with
Jordan and the West Bank and East Jerusalem were part of Jordan, and those were taken. And there's very few Jews in those territories. So that sounds more like a war of conquest to me, sir.
Not at all. And as far as the Gaza Strip, Israel would rather not be involved in it. The problem is that when they turned Gaza over to the Palestinian Authority and gave them this piece of land that's almost like the French Riviera, it's beautiful with beaches. They could have made that into a fantastic state, and Israel would have given them a lot more. But instead, they chose to turn it into a launching pad against the state of Israel itself. They launched
the thing is
and they built terror tunnels. Look, the point is
here's the thing. Here's the thing, though. You can't say the Nazis were fighting wars of conquest and then turn around and say Israel was defending itself when it's actually the other way around.
Look, you and I are going to have to disagree on this. The Nazis wanted to conquer all of Europe, and they've made that quite clear in their doctrine.
True. They did not declare. They did everything in their power to avoid the Second World War. Look at Rudolf Hess.
Well, they and Stalin, and by the way, it's not just the Nazis either. There's the Hitler-Stalin Pact, which is something people don't discuss. is
Yes.
what launched World War II. It wasn't just Hitler invading, the Nazis invading Poland. The communist Soviets also invaded Poland a few weeks later, and they divvied it up in half. And there were secret protocols in that agreement that divvied up all of Eastern Europe between both Russia and Germany. So that's really
there are open protocols between Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Winston Churchill to hand over Eastern Europe to Stalin. I mean, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a brief reprieve to try and actually because the Germans saw that the Soviets were entering into places like Finland, and now if you're fighting with the British and you are in Denmark and you see the Soviets marching into Finland, and the thing is that the Finns actually put up great resistance against the Soviets, and if you see that, Joseph Stalin's original plan was for the British and the French, who again, it was them who declared war on Germany, not Russia, not the Soviet Union. The British and the French declared war on Germany.
The Soviet Union were allied with Germany at the time. I mean,
the Soviets were not aligned with Germany. A truce. I mean, is Israel aligned with Jordan?
No, they were allied with Germany, and that's why the Hitler-Stalin Pact, which was signed on August 9th, 1939, was the alliance, and in that pact, they agreed to divvy up, as I said, Eastern Europe. Now, you're right, by the way, Eric, to point out that as the war was winding down with the Yalta Agreement, Roosevelt, who, by the way, was surrounded by pro-Soviet communists, including Alger Hiss, and I think he was already in a weakened physical condition at that point. He died a little afterwards. He turned over Poland and Eastern Europe to the Soviet Union. That is true. I mean, it's a very interesting and shameful chapter in American history.
Are you familiar with the Roosevelt Brain Trust?
I've heard of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, those were all Jewish people that were around.
That's
Mr.
not true.
Roosevelt. Oh, the Roosevelt the Brain Trust.
Even if they were
had Louis Brandeis on it, Warburg, Benjamin Cohen, Frankfurter.
No, I don't think so.
Oh, well, you can look this up.
I will look it up. I think he had one close Jewish advisor, and that was Morgenthau. But
Morgenthau was very prominent, yes, but also as advisors, he had Louis Brandeis, very famous Jew, Felix Frankfurter, Warburg.
They were the Supreme Court. They weren't involved with.
They were part of the original. No, Brandeis was part of the original Brain Trust in the first New Deal. So he was in the Supreme Court at the time. How could you look? I guess that let me get to this. I mean, I don't really know if I agree or know about this or not. But even if it were true and these people happen to be Jewish, what are you getting at? Do you think there's a Jewish conspiracy here to control the world? Well, I will say this. I'm not going to. This is what I'll say. I will say that America's behavior right before the Second World War, the average American did not support a war in Europe, did not support American entry in a war.
Neither did the average Jewish American.
Yes. The average Jewish American did support entry into a European theater.
No, that's untrue.
Okay, well, you can look at all the different
I would suggest
documentation of this from the 1930s.
Just as many Jewish as non-Jewish Americans who were opposed to the United States entering the war. There were elitists, both Jewish, non-Jewish, Christian, and otherwise, who were pushing Roosevelt to enter the war. And this is a subject that you and I probably agree on. I'm not sure we should have entered the war. And especially after the Stalin Pact, you had then a shift in the communist left in that they became anti-war because they wanted to help Stalin. And then when Hitler double-crossed Stalin with Operation Barbarossa, overnight, like a turn of the dime, they became super warlike, and they became super because they wanted to hurt Hitler because of that. I mean, it's not. I don't see this as having, to be with a great deal of Jewish influence. I mean, I know that you have this conspiracy theory about that.
It's not a conspiracy. It's the Roosevelt Brain Trust is considered to be one of the biggest lobbies or advisory groups that encouraged FDR to get into the Second World War, and for Churchill
I'd like to see.
I will send you the documentation if you'd like.
No, putting aside whether it matters, I'd like to see evidence that these people happen to be Jewish. I mean, I think that they were probably mostly WASPs, actually.
Well,
But
Samuel Untermeyer was certainly not a WASP. He was a Jew and a Zionist, and he was a big advocate for a Second World War against the Germans because he saw the Germans, right or wrong. I mean, it's not a conspiracy, Charles, because think of it this way: if you're Jewish and you see, and in your eyes, Jews are being targeted, right?
mm-hmm.
You're going to try and use your powers to try and get to stop that, right? Doesn't that make sense?
I agree, but that doesn't make it a Jewish conspiracy. It means that you have Jews who are very successful in virtually every area of life. And it's a very interesting subject in terms of why that is. Maybe you and I could talk about that at a different time. I have my theories, you may have yours. But, so yeah, they had risen to levels of influence and power, and many of them probably wanted to enter the war. Probably a lot of them didn't, too.
Well, can you name me a single prominent Jew who opposed the Second World War? Entry of America and Britain? Name me one.
I would say after Pearl Harbor, I couldn't. Before Pearl Harbor, I think we'd have to look at the roles of America first, and you'd probably find a good number of Jews involved with that.
Well, can you name me one?
No, I can't, but I will. Okay. I'll look into it. And
okay.
even if
America First was largely considered not just very goyish. America First was considered to be an anti-Semitic movement. That was the actual. If you look at Jewish press from the time, they called Charles Lindbergh an anti-Semite. There's even a show right now called The Plot Against America about Charles Lindbergh becoming president and persecuting the Jews. So
look, let me just interrupt here. I mean, I don't think that, there probably were anti-Semites in it, and they believed in the Jewish conspiracy, like Henry Ford, for example, who thought the Jews are secretly running the world and that kind of stuff. But that doesn't mean that there weren't Jews involved in it. And that whole line of thinking was wrong. I mean, the Jews aren't trying to control anything.
There's not one Jew who opposed America or Britain entering the Second World War. Not one. Okay, they were the ones. If you look at the focus group in Britain behind Churchill, that was the one that escalated the war from a phony war, as they called it, into a true disastrous meat grinder where 50 million, 60 million people died. This is history. This is not. I mean, if you went up to the average Jew and you asked them, they wouldn't even think this is controversial. Of course, the Jews supported America and Britain getting into the war.
Yeah, I mean, they did once the Nazis or the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Yeah,
no, they were pushing for this way before that, even when it was very unpopular. Look, in fact, that's why the American First movement became anti-Semitic. It's because they saw that it was not in America's interest to enter the European war, and yet all these Jewish organizations and communists, Zionists, either one, were all for the war. Okay, they were all pushing the government.
You're right about the communists. They were for the war, and a certain percentage of communists have Jewish backgrounds, and that's
a large percentage back then.
I would suggest that they were not, consonant with the values of the Jewish people or Judaism. We could look at the Bolsheviks. These people were Jews by name, but this wasn't really what Judaism is all about. It isn't what it's not what the faith is about or the people.
Well, many Jews at the time would have disagreed with you heavily.
Socialism, and you and I would agree, and I've written about this. Socialism, starting in the 19th century, particularly, made major inroads into Judaism, and there's a lot of. This is a subject that I actually think the Jewish people should come clean on. The reason we don't come clean on it is because we are still fearful, and to a certain extent rightfully, of the rise of anti-Semitism, and it's hard for us to admit, in a way, just like the German people have largely come clean on Nazism. The Russians are trying to struggle with the legacy of communism. I think the Jewish people need to admit that a large percentage of our people did move to the radical left. And this is a terrible stain, in my opinion, on the history of my people. Another reason they won't do it is because a lot of them are still on the left, and that's a disgrace. I agree with that. However,
what I would say though is that
it's not therefore constitute a Jewish conspiracy. It was a conspiracy against Judaism by Jews.
Jacob Schiff was a very prominent international Zionist, and he financed the Bolshevik Revolution. He used to be very close friends with Leon Trotsky. I mean, The thing is, Charles, listen, I understand that not every Jew on the street is part of any conspiracy. I'm not saying that. What I am saying, though, is that the Jewish leadership, and like it or not, Charles, they speak for you. They speak for you because when every Jewish organization seems to have the same opinions on things like immigration, the same opinions on things like the war with Syria, the same opinions on things like America's support for Zionism and Israel, that speaks for the Jewish community. And when the Jewish community goes out of its way, not just to hide that it had a role in many of these things. I mean, we don't when Jews talk about Nazism, they don't divorce the individual German from the Nazi government, usually, right? I mean, the German people as a whole have to pay reparations to Israel for the Second World War for what supposedly happened to Jews.
Reparations because
when Jews cover for other Jews, I'm not saying every Jew is a criminal or every Jew is a communist or every Jew is even a capitalist. What I'm saying here is that when the Jewish community comes together as a group and maybe hides or sweeps under the rug or protects its bad apples, right? That is bad for the reputation of the Jewish community, and that's what leads to anti-Semitism. Okay, that's what leads to it.
Okay. I tend to agree that there is a bit of a circling of the wagons, and again, I mean, it's kind of like a cart before the horse situation in that, and I don't want to talk in circles here, but it's because of concern over anti-Semitism that there is this kind of tendency to become a little too inward in terms of protecting people who shouldn't be protected. I agree with that. I mean, that's a psychological problem, and I think that in my opinion, we need to expose that. However, that doesn't constitute some kind of a Jewish conspiracy. Most average Jews are not interested in seeing the United States go to war. You have elitists who mostly are either communist or they're leftists who really left Judaism, who've become interested in that and have become interested along with plenty of non-Jews who they're joined by, particularly, I don't want to single out, but particularly the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant established.
Well, let me say this, Charles. Again, it's nothing personal, but you're sort of doing it here. I mean, you're telling me in this conversation that the Jewish community was not behind, or at least a big pressure group behind America and Britain's entry into the Second World War, and it's simply factually incorrect. It's factually incorrect.
Look, first of all, let me say this. I mean, after Pearl Harbor, yes. Maybe before Pearl Harbor, to the point where when you saw after Kristallnacht, when the Nazis were like tightening the screws on the Jews of Germany, there was calls for boycotting Germany. I don't know if I so far
before. Let me correct you on that. The international Jewish community was boycotting Germany.
Yes.
In 1933. Okay.
Well, that's when they started
the anti-Jewish. If you look at primary sources, for example, Joseph Goebbels' speech when the Germans began the anti-Jewish boycott, he says specifically that this is retaliation against the international Jewish community's economic attacks on Germany. That's what he said.
I don't agree with that.
He saw it as I'm telling you how from the German
retaliation against the fact that the Germans were confiscating Jewish properties and they were harassing Jewish people.
They were not doing that when they took power. That was an escalation that the Jewish community they started
it right after the Enabling Act. Which started already right after the Enabling Act in June of 1933. So, it started pretty early, and I think that the Jews reacted by trying to blow the whistle on it and say, we have to stand up to this. We're going to boycott Germany. Now, I don't think that therefore that means that they wanted to go to war against Germany. And by the way, you say that Israel had dealings and the Zionists had dealings with Germany.
I never said that.
Oh, you didn't?
I don't believe it. I don't.
Oh, okay. Because I mean, there was the so-called transfer agreement.
The Havre agreement, yeah.
Yeah, and it's still a very controversial thing in Israel. But the point is, I would argue that the mission of Israel is to rescue Jews and to try to help Jews go to Eretz Israel, the Promised Land. And that meant Germans. And I think that they were willing to make deals with Germany to help Jews do that. That's all that was. It wasn't that they were pro-Nazi, because I've heard this said by some people.
I don't agree with that either. Hitler, every every documented piece of history shows that Hitler sympathized more with the Palestinians on that front.
Right.
So
Hitler was a communist originally. I mean, check out my book, Was Hitler a Leftist? I get into a lot
I understand, but I don't really personally mind. Like, I don't care. I mean, a lot of great nationalists used to be leftists.
No, I do care, because I think that he carried that in, and to a certain extent, he may have stayed a communist. I don't know if it's outright, but you have to, they were moving toward this hyper nationalist state where you worship the state instead of worshiping God. It was totally.
Here's the thing. Here's the thing, Charles, and you know this as a Jew, is that people within a group can have different opinions. There might be a white person that has a German that has a socialist view of economics, and there might be another German that has a more market-oriented view. You have to reconcile those things within a country. You can't allow that to cause antagonisms that lead to civil wars, that lead to communist revolutions and things like that. In Israel, the Labor Party, the most far right, the most far left party in Israel, supports Zionism. They support Israel as a Jewish state.
In Israel support Zionism, but
right. So why is it okay for a Zionist to be left wing or form a left wing or have communist views even, and not a Nazi?
I'll tell you why. Because first of all, you're making Nazi Germany sound like the United States. You have different people. Yeah, sure, there were different opinions, but once Hitler enacted the Enabling Act and he confiscated all weapons from citizens and began to consolidate total power,
that never happened. German gun laws were more free after Hitler took power than under the Weimar Republic. Simply not true.
Fine. The point is that people were defenseless at that point, and you had a totalitarian system. So, sure, you might have differences of opinion. I don't doubt that for a minute. But the fact is that all of the power and all of the control was in the hand of this small elite group that ran the country, and that was Hitler and his entourage. Now, in Israel, it does tend to be left, but it's not the same thing. I mean, it's, you have conservatives. You've got a more conservative government under Netanyahu, actually. You've had a development of private ownership. It's on the left, but it's not as far to the left as Nazism is or communism.
Well, what is the actual distinction? I mean, the thing is...
The distinction is that it's a degree of freedom. I don't deny the fact that Israel is further to the left.
You can't buy land in Israel, Charles. You can't buy... if you look at the Anglo-Saxon liberal view of freedom, the top priority is private property. In Israel, private property is all to be ceded and acquiesced to the state depending on its need. I mean, there's no such thing in Israel.
We are agreeing on this. Israel is further to the left than the United States and probably most of the Western European countries. It's a relative thing. And that, they have a more centralized government. I would say that it's loosened up in recent decades. I'm against. I think that's hurt Israel. It doesn't mean that individual Israelis and Jews are in favor of that. I would say a large percentage of them are not. And it's not something that's inherent to Judaism. It has more to do with the way things developed in Israel. I think also another aspect of Zionism, which has never been discussed, namely because the left does control the argument there, is that there's always been a large religious Zionist movement and a large, kind of free market-y Zionist movement that goes way back. We just don't hear as much about it because the left side of the movement controls the high ground in a way, the way they do in the United States today.
Let me ask you a question, Charles. I'm getting a vibe that you're maybe more on the libertarian side of things in terms of your outlook. Political outlook?
Not necessarily. I consider myself to be conservative and populist and national.
Are you like a small government conservative?
Yes.
Okay. So here you are telling me that the Nazis were illegitimate, the Germans are illegitimate or whatever because they were former communists or whatever the merits of that argument may be. I personally agree with the NSDAP's economic platform. I think cooperative economics just make perfect sense in a nationalist country. Because if you believe that if you believe a nation is a family, you need to take care of it like a family. I don't disagree with that personally, but I see that you're trying to make the argument perhaps to more conservative-leaning temperaments that
Yes, I would say so.
yes,
I mean, I
right.
believe.
But here's the thing. Here's the thing. Here. My point, real quick, Charles, is that your small government conservatism doesn't stop you from supporting the state of Israel, which is essentially, by the American definition of socialism, a socialist country. You still support Israel, Charles. So why do you get to still support Israel, but then
tell you why? I don't support Israel because it's a socialist country. I support Israel because, for a lot of reasons. First of all, because I'm a Jew and I believe in the idea, the Jewish conception of that tiny little swath of land being a Jewish state to give the foothold for the coming of the Messiah. I have religious reasons for supporting Israel, and also for national reasons, for sovereign reasons, that the Jewish people have a right, I believe, or they've taken the right to determine their own control of their own lives and their own destinies, just like any other sovereign person. I mean,
that's fine. No. What I'm saying here, Charles, the point I'm making is that you seem to be very invested in getting Gentiles to be anti-Nazi because of some economic platform Hitler had. Meanwhile, you are a small government libertarian, and you support a country founded by many people who were communists from the Soviet Union, people that did not believe in private property. People, the state of Israel today does not believe in individual rights. They believe in collectivist rights. So why can't I use that to create a wedge between you and Zionism?
Because the main reason that I'm critical of Nazism is because it's anti-Semitic and because of how they carried that out. Their socialism is something that I also disagree with, but that wouldn't be enough to make me oppose it.
So why should that apply to whites?
Because the breaking point for me with the Nazi movement was its anti-Semitism. I don't like socialism. I don't like it in Israel either. But
then why do you make a different case when you talk to Gentiles about this? You say, oh, well, Hitler was a leftist, so you as a right-winger need to hate the leftists in Germany.
Look, I'm not making that. I'm simply pointing that out as a matter of history. But the main problem with it is the anti-Semitism. I mean, there's a lot of
why not say that? Make that argument.
Well, I'm sorry I wasn't clear about it. I'll be clear now. Anyways, but listen, Eric, I'm kind of reaching toward the end of the program.
No problem.
Very, very interesting conversation. You're obviously a very well thought out and bright guy, and you've got a lot of intellectual ferment. So maybe I'd like to do it again at some point. We'll do a follow up, maybe if you're interested, in a couple of weeks, and we'll keep talking about it. I think it's a valuable conversation.
Great. Thanks a lot, Charles.
All right, Eric. Listen, let people know, my viewers and listeners, if you want to, where they can learn about you and your work.
Okay. National-justice.com. Check it out when you get a chance. I do some journalism there. It's maybe some of your viewers might find that interesting.
All right, Eric Stryker. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Charles. You too.
All right. Take care.